Most gun makers are remembered for the guns they built. This one is remembered for the murders he solved. In London, a small gun house called E.J. Churchill built some of the finest shotguns in England, but its name became famous for something stranger. The man who ran it, Robert Churchill, was the country's most feared firearms expert. The man Scotland Yard called when a bullet had to testify in court. He helped send killers to the gallows. He championed a short, fast, hard-hitting game gun the establishment said could never work, and then proved every one of them wrong. For decades, a Churchill was a gun with a detective's mind behind it. Built in the heart of London, carried by men who could buy anything, and respected by the one expert no court could ignore. And then the great London gun trade began to collapse. The orders thinned, the benches emptied, and the house that armed gentlemen and convicted murderers faded into near silence. Every week we tell the story behind the name stamped on the steel, the men who built these guns, and the men who buried them. Subscribe if those stories matter to you. How did one London gunmaker end up deciding murder trials? How did a 25-inch barrel that everyone mocked become a legend? And how did a name this storied very nearly disappear? This is the rise, the reign, and the fall of E.J. Churchill, the gun house that sent men to the gallows. To understand what Edwin John Churchill built, you first have to understand the world he built it in. London at the close of the 19th century was the undisputed capital of the finest guns on earth, and the trade that made them was unlike any other craft in the world. A London-best gun was not manufactured the way a watch or a carriage was manufactured. It was assembled, slowly and by hand, from the labor of a dozen or more separate specialists, each of whom had spent a lifetime learning to do one thing, and one thing only, better than any other man alive. There were the barrel makers, who took rough tubes of steel and bored them, struck them, and filed them until the walls were even to within a few thousandths of an inch, then joined two of them together with such precision that they shot to the same point of aim. There were the actioners, the aristocrats of the trade, who cut and fitted the steel heart of the gun, the mechanism of locks and bolts and hinges, so that a barrel weighing several pounds would close onto the body with the soft, oiled click that a buyer learned to listen for and to trust. There were the stalkers, who shaped the walnut to the wood of the action and to the shoulder of one particular man, because a best gun was not built to a pattern, but to a customer, measured like a Savile Row suit. There were the finishers, who blacked the action and browned the barrels and regulated the triggers until each pull broke clean at the same weight. And there were the engravers, who covered the bare steel in fine English scroll, working with gravers and a small leather bag and a magnifying glass, turning a machine into an heirloom. These men rarely worked under one roof. They were outworkers, scattered through the small streets and upper rooms of the gun quarter, and a firm like the one Edwin Churchill would build did not so much make a gun as commission it, gathering the work of these hidden hands and putting its own name on the rib. The name on the rib was a promise. It said that somebody had stood over every one of those trades and judged the result good enough to be sold as the best in the world. That judgment, that eye, was the whole business, and it was an eye that Edwin John Churchill had been training since he was a boy. He had learned the trade the hard way, apprenticed in the West Country at the firm of Geoffrey of Dorchester, before he came up to London to work for the gunmaker F.T. Baker. He was, by every account that survives, a fine practical gunmaker, and something rarer still, a genuinely gifted shot and a gifted fitter of guns, a man who could watch another man mount a gun to his shoulder and tell him exactly what was wrong with it. In 1891, he set up on his own account at number 8 Agar Street, just off the Strand, in the heart of the West End where the money was. And there, in those first years, he found his market not among the landed gentlemen who shot driven pheasants, but among the men who shot live pigeons for money. Live pigeon shooting in the 1890s was one of the great gambling sports of the wealthy. Birds were released from traps, sprung suddenly into the air, and the shooter had only an instant to kill them before they cleared the boundary of the ground. Enormous sums of money changed hands on a single bird. The great venues were on the continent, above all at Monte Carlo, where the rich of two hemispheres gathered each season to shoot and to wager. And a sport decided in fractions of a second placed a particular and unforgiving demand on a gun. It had to come up fast, point true, and fire the instant it touched the shoulder. The pigeon trade rewarded speed and pointing above everything else, and Edwin Churchill, who understood gun fit better than almost anyone, built pigeon guns that suited that ruthless little world. His reputation among the professional pigeon shooting fraternity grew quickly, and with it grew something that would matter to the firm for the next 100 years: the attention of rich Americans. For the East Coast American sporting set, the road to Monte Carlo ran through London, and a gun by a fashionable London maker was both a tool and a trophy. One of the earliest and most telling of these customers was the New York sportsman and millionaire W. Gould Brokaw. In 1898, Brokaw ordered from Churchill a light, quick quail gun with barrels just over 26 inches for use on his shooting plantation in the American South. It was a small order in itself, but it was the first of many, and it pointed to a pattern that would define the house: the wealthy American who came first for a pigeon gun, then for a game gun, and who told his friends. The American trade, begun in those Agar Street years, would outlast the pigeon sport, outlast Edwin himself, and become one of the firm's deepest roots. But the very thing that had made Edwin Churchill was about to be taken away from him. As the new century opened, live pigeon shooting fell steadily out of fashion and, in places, out of legality, condemned as cruel and pushed to the margins. The market that had built his name began to shrink beneath him, and then came a blow no business could absorb. In 1902, Edwin's son died. The loss broke something in him that the loss of a market never could. He sank into a deep and lasting depression, and his grip on the firm and on himself slowly loosened. For the rest of the decade, the business drifted, kept alive more by reputation than by vigor, until in 1910, Edwin John Churchill died, leaving behind a famous name, a fashionable address, and a firm that was very nearly finished. What saved E.J. Churchill was not a thing, but a person, and an unlikely one. Edwin had a nephew named Robert Churchill, a young man who had come into the business as a teenager, learning the trade and the customers from the inside. When his uncle died in 1910, Robert was just 24 years old. He was short, stout, increasingly heavy as the years went on, with a round face and a bulldog manner, and he was about to take a dying London gun house and turn it into one of the most talked about names in the country. Robert Churchill's first achievement was simply to keep the doors open. He raised capital, steadied the accounts, and held the firm together through the upheaval of the First World War, when the luxury trade in fine sporting guns all but vanished, and the skilled craftsmen of the gun quarter were swallowed by the army and the munitions factories. In 1917, in the middle of that war, he incorporated the business as E.J. Churchill, Gunmakers, Limited, putting it on a firmer footing for whatever came after. But survival was never going to be enough for Robert Churchill. He was a salesman of genius and a self-promoter without shame, and he understood something his late uncle, the quiet craftsman, perhaps never had, that in a crowded trade where every London maker could build a superb gun, what sold a gun was not only the steel, but the story. And Robert Churchill had a story. Its name was the 25. To understand why the 25 caused such an argument, you have to understand the orthodoxy it offended. For generations, the received wisdom of the English game shooting world held that a proper game gun carried barrels of 30 inches, or near it. Long barrels, it was believed, shot harder, pointed more steadily, and threw a better pattern at distance. A short-barreled gun was regarded as a thing for close work or for cripples, not for a serious shot facing high-driven birds. Into that settled belief, Robert Churchill introduced a best-quality game gun with barrels of just 25 inches, and he marketed it not as a compromise, but as an improvement. He gave it a Roman numeral name, the 25, and he turned the whole weight of his salesmanship behind it. The exact birth of the 25 is wrapped in stories that Churchill himself was happy to let circulate, and which the careful collector should treat as trade legend rather than gospel. One tale held that he had bulged the muzzles of a 30-inch pigeon gun by firing it with snow packed in the barrels, and had simply cut the ruined ends back to 25 inches and gone on shooting, to his own surprise, rather well. Another held that a customer's gun had been dropped and dented at the muzzles, shortened to save it for the season, and that the client shot so much better afterwards that he ordered a matching pair built short on purpose. Whatever the truth, the gun itself was refined into its settled form in the years around 1913 to 1915, and it carried two genuine pieces of cleverness. The first was practical. Shorter barrels meant a lighter, livelier gun, one that started and swung faster between the hands, and Churchill argued, with real force, that for the way most birds are actually shot, the speed of the swing mattered far more than the theoretical pattern of an extra 5 inches of barrel. The second piece of cleverness was pure showmanship, made solid in steel, the rib. The flat-top surface running along the barrels, the rib, was on the 25 made narrow and raised and tapered, rising at the breech and falling away toward the muzzle in a fine inverted line. Churchill explained that this taper was designed to harmonize with the perspective effect of the barrels, so that a gun with barrels of only 25 inches conveyed to the shooter's eye the impression of a full 30. In plain terms, he had built an optical illusion into a shotgun. The short barrels handled like short barrels and felt fast, but when the man behind them looked down the rib, his eye told him he was holding the long gun he had always trusted. It was, depending on whom you asked, either a genuine insight into how human beings actually point a gun, or the most brilliant piece of marketing the London trade had ever seen. It was probably both. The trade itself was divided, and loudly. Rival makers and traditionalists sneered that the 25 was a gimmick, that it threw a poorer pattern, that it was a stunt dressed up as science. Churchill answered them the way he answered everything, with confidence, with demonstration, and with an endless supply of words, and the customers decided the argument in his favor. By the middle of the 1920s, demand for the 25 outpaced the firm's ability to build them. It became the signature Churchill gun, the thing the house was known for, and a quiet revolution in what an Englishman might be willing to carry into a covert. The flattery of imitation followed, as it always does. The short-barreled, raised rib style was copied widely, and in later decades, the great Spanish makers, among them the respected firm of Aya, would build their own guns in clear homage to the Churchill pattern, putting the idea Robert Churchill had popularized within reach of shooters who could never have afforded a London best. But Robert Churchill did not stop at selling guns. He set out to teach men how to shoot them, and in doing so, he built the second pillar of his fame. The peak of Robert Churchill's reign was not a single moment, but two parallel careers, each feeding the other, and both feeding the firm. The first of these was Churchill the teacher. He developed and tirelessly promoted a method of shooting, a complete system of stance, gun mount, and movement that became known simply as the Churchill method. Its heart was a kind of trained instinct. Churchill taught his pupils not to calculate the lead in front of a crossing bird, not to consciously measure how far ahead to aim, but to fix the eye on the bird itself. Mount the gun smoothly to the face, swing the muzzles up through the line of the bird, and fire the instant they passed its head, trusting the eye and the body to supply the forward allowance without conscious thought. The shorter, faster gun, of course, suited this method perfectly, and the method sold the gun, and the gun proved the method, in a circle that Churchill kept turning for 30 years. He set the method down in print. His first book, How to Shoot, appeared in 1925, with a revised edition following in 1927, laying out the system in plain instructional terms. Decades later, the teaching would be expanded and given its fullest form in the book Game Shooting, produced with the writer Macdonald Hastings, who became Churchill's friend, his chronicler, and the keeper of his reputation. Hastings would later call him perhaps the last of the great gunmakers of London. The endurance of the method is the truest measure of it. Long after Robert Churchill was gone, instructors trained in his system carried it forward, and the Churchill method continued to be taught at the most famous shooting grounds in England, among them the school of the great House of Holland and Holland, so that men who had never heard the name learned to shoot the way a stout London gunmaker had taught their grandfathers. To shape not just the guns of an age, but the way an age learned to use them is a rare kind of influence, and Robert Churchill had it. And yet, for all the guns he sold and all the men he taught, it is the second of Robert Churchill's careers that carried his name furthest beyond the world of sport, into the newspapers, the courtrooms, and the public imagination. For Robert Churchill became one of the foremost forensic firearms experts in Britain, the man the police and the prosecution called when a killing turned on the question of which gun had fired the fatal shot. He was perfectly placed for it. A man who built and regulated guns for a living understood as a matter of daily craft how a barrel was bored, how a firing pin struck, how the working surfaces of a particular weapon left their marks. And he set himself to learn the new science that was emerging in those years, the science of matching a bullet or a fired cartridge case to the one gun out of all the guns in the world that had fired it. The principle rested on a simple and powerful fact. The inside of a barrel, the face of a breech, the tip of a firing pin, each carried microscopic imperfections, tiny scratches and tool marks, and flaws unique to that weapon. And as a bullet was driven down the bore, and a cartridge case was slammed back against the breech, those imperfections were stamped into the soft metal like a signature. Two bullets fired from the same gun would carry the same fine pattern of scratches. Two bullets from different guns would not. The instrument that made this readable to a jury was the comparison microscope, a device that joined two microscopes through a single optical bridge, so that an examiner could view two objects side by side in one field, one half of the circle showing the bullet recovered from the body, the other half showing a bullet test-fired from the suspect's gun. The lines of scratches met and matched across the dividing line, like the two halves of a torn banknote. The case was made. The instrument itself was the work of others, refined in the United States in those same years. But Robert Churchill became a master of its use in Britain and a great believer in what it could prove. And in 1929, he set down the principles of the work in a book, The Forensic Examination of Firearms and Projectiles, helping to establish the discipline in the British courts. But it was a single, brutal case that made his name a household word. In September 1927, in the dark of early morning, on a quiet road in the Essex countryside, a village policeman named George Gutteridge was stopped by a passing car and was shot dead. He was hit 4 times. 2 of the shots had been fired with deliberate and shocking cruelty into his eyes. The killing of an unarmed country constable on a lonely lane horrified the public, and the hunt for his killers became one of the great manhunts of the age. Suspicion eventually fell on 2 men, Frederick Guy Brown and William Henry Kennedy, known as Pat Kennedy, career criminals tied to a stolen car. And when the police recovered a Webley revolver connected to Brown, the case was handed, in part, to Robert Churchill. At the scene, in the abandoned car the killers had used, investigators had recovered a spent cartridge case. Churchill examined it under the comparison microscope alongside cases test-fired from the Webley revolver found in Brown's possession. He found that the breech face of that particular revolver carried a distinctive flaw, a small imperfection in the metal, and that this flaw had stamped its own unmistakable mark onto the spent case from the murder scene, the same mark it left on every case fired through it. The cartridge that had helped kill George Gutteridge, Churchill testified, had been fired from that revolver and from no other gun on earth. At the trial in 1928, his evidence, calm, technical, and devastating, carried enormous weight with the jury. Brown and Kennedy were convicted of the murder, and on the 31st of May, 1928, they were hanged, in different prisons, at the same hour of the same morning. A newspaper of the day summed up the verdict in a phrase that followed Robert Churchill for the rest of his life. The two men, it said, had been hanged by a microscope. It is a phrase worth pausing on, because it captures both the power of the new science and the danger in it. The conviction in the Gutteridge case rested on more than the cartridge alone, but it was the microscope and Churchill's confident reading of it that gripped the public mind. After that case, he was a celebrity expert, summoned to the witness box in case after case, his bulldog certainty a fixture of the criminal courts. And it was that very certainty, in time, that would meet its limit. The crack ran, as cracks so often do, straight through the source of the strength. The thing that made Robert Churchill formidable in a courtroom was his absolute, unshakable confidence. And confidence is a fine quality in a salesman and a dangerous one in an expert witness. The forensic science he championed was real and valuable, but it was newer and softer and more open to honest dispute than the public, dazzled by the phrase "hanged by a microscope," had been led to believe. The day would come when that confidence was met, in open court, by a barrister who refused to be impressed by it. It came in 1932, in the case of Elvira Barney. She was a wealthy young society woman, the daughter of a baronet, living a fast and scandalous life in a mews flat in Knightsbridge. One night, her lover, a young man named Michael Scott Stephen, was shot dead in that flat with her pistol. Mrs. Barney's account was that there had been no murder at all, that she had threatened to take her own life, and that the gun had gone off in a struggle as Stephen tried to wrest it from her. The Crown said otherwise, and once again, Robert Churchill was called as a principal witness for the prosecution. His evidence went to the mechanism of the weapon. He told the court that the revolver had a strong, heavy trigger pull, the clear implication being that such a gun could not simply discharge by accident in a scuffle, that someone had to mean to fire it. But Elvira Barney had retained one of the most formidable advocates of the age, the great defense barrister Sir Patrick Hastings. And Hastings was not a man to let his client be hanged by a microscope or by an expert's assurance. When he rose to cross-examine, he did not argue with Churchill about the mechanics of trigger pulls. He simply took up the revolver in front of the jury, pointed it safely toward the ceiling, and pulled the trigger again and again and again, easily, rapidly, making the supposedly heavy and deliberate pull look like nothing at all. The performance did to Churchill's confident testimony what the cartridge case had once done to Brown and Kennedy. The jury saw, with their own eyes, a reason to doubt. Elvira Barney was acquitted, of murder and of manslaughter both, and walked free. The collector and the historian should be careful here, and resist the temptation to make the Barney case more than it was. It was not proof that Robert Churchill was a charlatan, nor that the science he practiced was worthless. It was something subtler and more important. It was a public demonstration that forensic firearms evidence, however impressive, was still evidence to be tested and weighed, not holy writ, and that the confidence of even the most celebrated expert could outrun the certainty of his science. The two cases together, the gallows of 1928 and the acquittal of 1932, mark the high water line of Robert Churchill, the forensic man, the moment. His powers were shown to be both real and bounded. Beyond the courtroom, though, a far larger and slower tide was already turning against everything he and his firm stood for. That tide was the long decline of the entire London best gun trade, and it was bigger than any one house. The world that had created the bespoke London gun was a world of large landed estates, abundant cheap skilled labor, and a leisured class with the time and the money to shoot driven game on a grand scale and to wait 2 years for a hand-built pair of guns. That world was dying. The First World War had killed a generation of the young men who would have inherited the great estates and ordered the great guns, and it had scattered the gun trade's irreplaceable craftsmen. The years between the wars, for all of Robert Churchill's brilliance, were lived in the long shadow of that loss. Then came the Second World War, and a second, deeper blow. Again, the luxury trade froze. Again, the workshops emptied, and this time the social order that had supported the whole enterprise, the great houses, the armies of servants, the vast shooting parties, did not come back as it had been. Taxation, death duties, and a changed Britain saw to that. The pool of men who could order a London best gun grew shallower with every passing year, and the pool of craftsmen who could build one grew shallower still, for the apprenticeships that had filled the gun quarter were vanishing. Robert Churchill himself worked on through it all, still building, still teaching, still testifying, a living link to the Edwardian heyday until his death in 1958. With him went the last of the family that had given the firm its name and the force of personality that had carried it for nearly half a century. The house survived him, but it survived into an unkind age. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, the economics of the English gun trade grew steadily harsher, and then the savage inflation of the 1970s fell upon it like a hammer. A best gun was a thing made almost entirely of skilled human hours, and when the cost of those hours soared while the number of customers shrank, the arithmetic of the bespoke trade became impossible. Famous old names across London faltered and folded, and E.J. Churchill, the house that had sent men to the gallows and taught a nation to shoot, was running out of time. Around 1980, the original firm came to its end. The workshops fell silent, and the long story that had begun at 8 Agar Street appeared to be over. What followed was, in its way, a fitting and faintly ironic coda. In 1981, the firm's remaining stock of guns was gathered up and sent across the Atlantic to be sold at auction. Not in London, not in Monte Carlo, but in Dallas, Texas, deep in the country, whose wealthy sportsmen had been among Churchill's first and most faithful customers nearly a century before. Close to 100 new side-by-side shotguns went under the hammer, and the sale realized a total of some $680,000 before the buyer's premium. An English magazine, watching from afar, found a melancholy aptness in it, that Dallas of all places should witness the demise of the company, built up by the man it called arguably the greatest and most controversial gunmaker of them all. The guns scattered into private collections. The name went quiet. The story of the great London house seemed to have closed on a strange American stage, far from the Strand. But a name like Churchill does not die easily, and this one did not stay dead. In the late 1980s, on the rolling chalk country of the West Wickham estate in Buckinghamshire, on land long held by the Dashwood family, a new shooting ground was established under Sir Edward Dashwood, a place for sportsmen to shoot clays and learn their craft. In time, that enterprise reached back and reclaimed the heritage that had gone quiet, acquiring the Churchill name and the firm's old record books from the holding company that had come to own them, and re-establishing E.J. Churchill as a living concern. The house that had begun off the Strand in the age of the live pigeon trap and had seemed to end on an auctioneer's block in Texas was given a second life in the English countryside, building and selling guns and teaching shooting under the old famous name. So what, in the end, are we to make of E.J. Churchill and of the stout, certain, unforgettable man at the center of it? The firm's true legacy is not really a building or even a balance sheet, but a set of ideas that escaped the workshop and went out into the world. There is the 25, the short, fast, raised rib gun that taught the English sporting world that the way a gun handled in the hands might matter more than the inches printed in the catalog. An idea copied so widely from the Spanish benches of Aya outward that it outgrew the firm entirely. There is the Churchill method, a way of teaching ordinary men to shoot flying birds by trained instinct rather than calculation, still taught at the great shooting grounds of England long after its author was gone. And there is the harder, darker legacy of the comparison microscope and the witness box, of the science that hanged Brown and Kennedy and was checked 4 years later in the matter of Elvira Barney, a science that Robert Churchill helped carry into the British courtroom and that helped teach the law both how powerful expert evidence could be and why it must always be tested. A gun house that shaped how a nation shot and helped shape how it judged a killing. Few firms of any kind can claim as much. If this story has held your attention, I would genuinely like to know which part of it stayed with you. Was it the optical trick built into the 25, the long, slow death of the London best gun trade, or the cartridge case beneath the microscope that sent 2 men to the gallows on the same morning? Tell me in the comments below. because the small details you remember often point me toward the next story worth telling. And if you enjoy this kind of careful, true history of the great gunmakers and the people who built them, please take a moment to subscribe so that the next time one of these vanished houses gives up its story, you will be among the first to hear it.